All right, so we're diving into a world that's fascinating, to say the least,
Yeah.
and frankly, kind of bewildering.
hmm
You wanted to understand this spiritual movement that's been making waves. And the sources you sent,
Yeah.
court documents, forum posts, articles, letters, they paint a really intricate picture. We're talking about a group tied to politics,
Right.
business,
Mhm.
and some really intriguing people.
Yeah, what immediately stands out is the contrast. We see this spiritual movement, the Science of Identity Foundation, SIS-UV, with roots in traditional Hindu philosophy. But on the other hand, there are these allegations of cult-like behavior,
Mhm.
financial irregularities, and even connections to this global marketing company called QNet, which has faced accusations of running a pyramid scheme.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle
Yeah.
where some pieces seem to fit and others just don't belong at all. But that's what makes this deep dive so compelling.
Right.
I
Exactly.
need to figure out how these seemingly disparate pieces connect.
Yeah, and to do that, we have to start with the central figure, Chris Butler, also known as Jagaguru Siddheswarupananda Paramahamsa. Now, to his followers, he's a revered spiritual leader, a guru who guides them towards self-realization. But the picture from ex-members is starkly different.
Yeah, in these forum posts, they describe him as controlling,
Right.
manipulative,
Yeah.
even abusive. Some even compare him to figures like David Koresh and Jim Jones. It's pretty jarring to see those kinds of accusations leveled at someone who's supposed to be a spiritual guide.
And what's really interesting is how those accusations intersect with the allegations of financial exploitation. Former members describe Butler living this lavish lifestyle, funded by donations from his followers, many of whom were living and working communally, often for little or no pay.
And it's not just anecdotal. We see evidence in the financial records from the movement's down-to-earth vegetarian grocery chain in Hawaii. The chain seems to be a major source of income for the movement, but there are questions about how those funds are being used and whether it aligns with the movement's spiritual values.
That connection between the grocery chain and the movement is definitely a point worth unpacking. It seems counterintuitive. A spiritual organization running a successful grocery business. This is where understanding QNet comes in. It's this multi-level marketing company that's faced accusations of being a pyramid scheme. And according to these articles, there are direct ties between QNet and high-ranking members of SISI.
So we're not just talking about a spiritual leader with a questionable lifestyle. We're talking about potential financial impropriety on a global scale, possibly even criminal activity. It definitely adds another layer of complexity.
Absolutely. And this complexity is amplified when we consider the movement's political connections. Particularly in Hawaii, we have the Gabbard family, Mike Gabbard, Carol Gabbard, and their daughter Tulsi Gabbard, the former U.S. Congresswoman. They've all been associated with SEF and have held political office.
And the connection to Tulsi Gabbard is especially intriguing because she's presented herself as a Hindu on the national stage. It makes you wonder about the movement's potential influence within the American political landscape, particularly within the Hindu community.
It's a valid point, and one that's raised repeatedly in these forum posts. Many former members express concern about the movement's political ambitions and whether those ambitions align with their spiritual values.
It also seems like Gabbard has tried to distance herself from the movement in recent years, especially during her presidential campaign. I guess that's understandable given the controversies
Yeah.
surrounding the movement and its founder.
It certainly highlights the difficult position that individuals associated with the movement find themselves in, trying to reconcile their personal beliefs with the actions of the movement and its leader is a recurring theme in these personal letters from former members.
One letter in particular stands out. It's from a devotee named Krishna Karunya, and they talk about feeling a deep disconnect between the spiritual teachings they were seeking and the reality of life within the movement. They express this longing for a deeper understanding of their faith, but feel limited by the restrictions imposed by SIF.
That sense of restriction is a common thread in many of the letters. Former members talk about being discouraged from seeking spiritual guidance outside of Butler's teachings, and some even describe facing pressure to sever ties with family and friends who question the movement.
That's where the comparisons to cults really start to resonate, right?
Right.
This idea of isolating members and controlling their access to information is a classic tactic used to maintain power and prevent dissent.
Precisely. And when you add in the financial aspect, the allegations of exploitation and the potential ties to a pyramid scheme, the picture becomes even more concerning.
It's certainly a far cry from the image of peace and enlightenment that many associate with spiritual movements.
It also raises a bigger question. Can a spiritual movement truly remain separate from its founders' personal and business dealings? And if not, what does that mean for the followers who have dedicated their lives to those teachings?
That's something to keep in mind as we move forward. We've only scratched the surface of this complex and often contradictory world. But one thing's for sure, it's a story that deserves to be told.
Welcome back.
Hi.
Let's shift gears a bit and explore the core philosophy and practices of Suf. Maybe understanding their beliefs might help us make sense of these contradictions we've been talking about.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
If we can grasp what they believe in, maybe we can get a better sense of why people are drawn to this movement.
Right. At its heart, Suf seems to draw heavily from Hindu philosophy, particularly the concept of bhakti yoga. Essentially, it's about cultivating love and devotion towards a supreme being, in this case, Krishna.
So it's about connecting with the divine through love and devotion. That seems pretty straightforward. What makes their approach unique?
Well, the emphasis on the guru is where things get a bit more complicated. From what I'm seeing in these sources, Butler's role goes beyond that of a teacher. He's portrayed as this infallible guide, someone whose every word should be followed without question.
And that's where those concerns about potential cult-like behavior come into play.
Right.
That level of devotion to a leader can be a slippery slope.
Absolutely. Especially when you look at the accounts from former members. They describe intense pressure to adhere to strict dietary and lifestyle guidelines dictated by Butler. We're talking about long hours of chanting, meditation, and service to the movement, often at the expense of personal time, and even relationships outside the group.
It's almost like there's this hierarchy within the movement.
Hmm.
Butler at the top, then his inner circle, and then the rank-and-file devotees, who are expected to follow without question.
That's a pattern we see in a lot of groups that exhibit cult-like tendencies. The leader becomes the sole source of truth, and anyone who questions that authority is seen as a threat.
Okay, so we've got these philosophical underpinnings, with the focus on bhakti yoga and guru devotion. But what about the day-to-day experience of being a follower? What are the actual practices that make up their spiritual life?
Well, meditation is definitely a central element. They emphasize various techniques, and they even have these dedicated retreats focused on introspection and connecting with one's inner self.
That actually sounds kind of appealing.
Mm.
Who wouldn't want to learn how to quiet their mind and find inner peace?
Right. And it's important to acknowledge that many former members do describe finding a sense of purpose and community within the movement. At least initially, they may have genuinely benefited from the structured lifestyle, the emphasis on personal growth, or the support of fellow devotees.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There are people who have had positive experiences.
Absolutely. It would be a mistake to paint everyone with the same brush. Human experiences are nuanced, and what might feel restrictive or harmful to one person could be a source of comfort and stability for another.
That makes sense. It reminds me of those letters we discussed earlier. Some expressed deep gratitude for the teachings and the community they found in Suf. Others, like Krishna Karunya, described feeling stifled and yearning for something more.
Exactly. And those contrasting experiences highlight the complexity of spiritual journeys. What matters most is that individuals feel empowered to make their own choices and define their own paths, free from coercion or manipulation.
And that's where those red flags we talked about earlier become so important.
Right.
Being aware of the potential for undue influence within spiritual groups allows people to approach their own spiritual seeking with a healthy dose of discernment.
Exactly. It's not about dismissing any particular path outright, but rather encouraging a critical and questioning mindset.
Speaking of change, it seems like the movement itself has evolved quite a bit over time. Those early sources from the 70s and 80s depict a very different Sif than what we see today. Back then, it was more of a fringe group, with members living communally and adopting a very distinct appearance.
Yeah, but as they gain wealth and influence, they seem to have shifted towards a more mainstream image. Now, members are encouraged to integrate into society, pursue careers, even participate in politics. It's a pretty significant shift in focus.
And their use of media and entertainment to spread their message has definitely played a role in that shift. Alana's yoga videos, for example, reached a huge audience and introduced a lot of people to Sif without necessarily delving into the deeper and perhaps more controversial aspects of the movement.
Their foray into animation with the ninja cartoon is another interesting example. It seems like they're consciously trying to appeal to a younger generation and integrate their teachings into popular culture.
It begs the question, can a spiritual movement retain its core values while also embracing mainstream culture? Or do those two things inevitably clash?
That's a tough question, and it's one that LaSif, with its history of contradictions and controversies, will have to grapple with as it moves forward.
Especially with all the challenges they faced in recent years. The allegations against Butler, the legal troubles with QNet, the scrutiny surrounding Tulsi Gabbard's political career, it's all created this cloud of suspicion around the movement.
You're right, and those challenges will definitely shape their trajectory. In the years to come, will they double down on their traditional beliefs and risk further isolation? Or will they try to adapt and rebrand themselves, potentially alienating their core base in the process?
Those are some big questions.
Yeah.
And as we head into the final part of this deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where all of this might be headed. What does the future hold for this movement? So we've explored the philosophy, the practices, the controversies, even the grocery stores. What I'm still grappling with is, the movement's future. Like, which path do they take after all this?
Yeah, it's fascinating to consider, isn't
Yeah.
it? They're at a crossroads. One route could be further integration into mainstream society.
Yeah.
They could tone down the guru-centric aspects, focus on the yoga, the meditation, healthy living, almost like a wellness brand.
Yeah, that makes sense strategically. They'd appeal to a wider audience, maybe even shed some of that negative baggage.
Exactly. But there's a risk, too. Longtime devotees, the ones deeply committed to Butler and his teachings, might feel alienated.
Right, it's a tightrope walk. Maintain the essence. While appealing to a broader audience, it makes me think of those personal letters. Some expressed a genuine desire for deeper spiritual understanding, but felt limited by the movement's restrictions.
Those voices are important to consider, because the other path, the alternative to mainstream appeal, is to retrench, become even more insular, more defensive, maybe even more reliant on Butler's authority.
And that has its own set of dangers, too.
Right.
Further isolation, more accusations of being a cult.
Exactly. And the legal issues surrounding QNet won't just disappear. Those could escalate, further damaging the movement's reputation.
So adapt or dig in their heels seems like a defining moment for SIF. But there's another layer to all this that keeps nagging at me.
What's that?
Individual responsibility. We've talked about the movement's tactics, the potential for manipulation. But ultimately, people are choosing to join, choosing to stay.
That's an important point, and one that often gets overlooked in these kinds of discussions. It's easy to see followers as just victims, completely under the sway of a charismatic leader.
But it's not that simple.
Right, yeah.
People have agency. They make choices, even within a system that might be designed to limit their options.
We can't ignore the power dynamics at play, the potential for coercion. But we also can't absolve individuals of responsibility for their own decisions. It's a complex interplay.
Which is why I think this deep dive has been so valuable. It's not about dictating answers. It's about equipping our listener with the knowledge to understand the complexities, the nuances.
To recognize the red flags, the warning signs, but also to appreciate the genuine spiritual seeking that might lead someone to a group like this.
And maybe even spark a deeper conversation about the nature of belief itself. Why do we seek out gurus, leaders, systems of thought? What need are we trying to fulfill?
Those are questions worth pondering, regardless of one's spiritual path, or lack thereof. Because ultimately, the journey is personal. It's about finding what resonates, what feels authentic, what leads to a sense of meaning and purpose.
That's a great note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground, the good, the bad, the downright bizarre. We've delved into teachings, finances, personalities, and that ever-present tension between spiritual seeking and worldly affairs. But more importantly, we've provided our listener with a framework for understanding this movement, and perhaps even for navigating their own spiritual path.
Knowledge is power. By understanding the dynamics at play in groups like Saifa, we can make more informed choices about where we place our trust, our time, and our energy.
So as you continue exploring this topic, be curious, be skeptical, and above all, be true to yourself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.